If you built a multi-rotor in the last 8 years, then there's almost 100% chance that that multi-rotor had an ESC that was running BL Heli firmware. And that's why it's such a big deal that recently BL Heli announced that they were going out of business. In this video, we're going to talk about, well, why? Why did they go out of business? What does this mean for the ESCs that you're running today? What do you need to do as a result of this? Or, spoiler, not do. And, what does this mean for the FPV market as a whole? I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Before we get into what you need to do as a result of this, let's get a bigger picture view of who is BL Heli and why did this happen. And BL Heli is a company and they make firmware for ESCs. A long time ago, the firmware was just called BL Heli and it was originally designed for use on helicopters, as opposed to other firmwares that had been designed specifically for use on airplanes, which have different needs than helicopters. But the BL Heli firmware also came to be used on multi-rotors and came to be the dominant firmware used on multi-rotors today. There have been several evolutions of the BL Heli firmware. The very oldest was BL Heli. After that came BL Heli S, and today we have BL Heli 32. And that distinction is going to matter as we go forward and you see how this actually affects you. To find out why BL Heli shut down, we go straight to this letter from the company that makes BL Heli. And they say that their decision to shut down has been driven by the increasingly complex geopolitical landscape and the associated risks of BL Heli 32 being utilized in drones for warfare, including potential use by Russia. Norway has imposed very strict export control regulations based on the European Union's legal framework, and the BL Heli 32 technology is vulnerable to these export control restrictions and prohibitions. And the gist of the decision is that BL Heli ESCs can and probably are being used in drones that are being used to wage war. And there are restrictions in the European Union about doing that, and basically BL Heli feels like they can't continue to operate under these restrictions. Now, I'm not here to weigh in on how valid or invalid that decision is. When I first heard it, I thought, well, there's lots of technologies out there that theoretically are making their way onto the battlefield through various means, and as long as the manufacturers have plausible deniability, then they can continue to operate. I bought a drone from iFlight just the other day, and before I bought it, I had to check a box that said, by the way, you're not allowed to use this in war. And I checked the box and I bought the drone, and I don't know. But for whatever reason, the BL Heli devs feel like they cannot continue to operate under the current situation. And as the owners of the business, that's their decision to make. In order to understand what this means for you, let's take a quadcopter running BL Heli and plug it in and try to use it. And the first thing you need to know is that if you've got a BL Heli 32 ESC in a quadcopter right now, it's gonna keep working. It has no idea that BL Heli 32 has shut down. It just is you tell me to spin motors, I spin motors. So as we get into the question of what does this mean for you today and what do you need to do, I want you to be aware that one of the answers is nothing. You don't have to do anything. Just keep using the working ESCs that you have, unless you feel like there's a need to update them, maybe they have a bug in the firmware. More on that also later in the video. Not only can I spin the motors, but if I connect with BL Heli Suite 32, the software that's used to manage BL Heli 32 ESCs, and I hit read setup, I can read the setup off the ESCs. And if I want to, I can change any of these settings and write the setup. I can do all of the configuration things in this ESC that I normally could. But there's one thing that I can't do, and that's flash the ESC. So right now I'm on firmware 32.9, and if I decided I wanted to flash to another version of the firmware, when I hit flash BL Heli, I get this message. Server is down for maintenance. Please try again later. Thank you for your patience. Well, I hate to spoil the surprise, but if you try again later, it will also not work. The server will be down for maintenance forever. Now, I said that you can't flash your BL Heli 32 ESC anymore, but if you're running a BL Heli ESC, there's a chance that it has BL Heli S on it. So here's an iFlight Blitz E55 32-bit ESC, and here's that same ESC in 8-bit format. The 32-bit ESC is running BL Heli 32, the 8-bit ESC is running BL Heli S. And that's a big deal because BL Heli S was released open source. It still exists today, and it's still being maintained in one form or another by people other than the BLHeli devs. At some point in the past, the BLHeli devs said, we're tired of supporting this firmware for all these manufacturers for free. And they released BLHeli 32 as closed source. They never published the source, and they put a licensing requirement on it. So every manufacturer that made a BLHeli 32 ESC paid a small amount of money to the BLHeli devs. I have no quibble with them making the 32-bit firmware closed source, but it does mean that today, when they go out of business, this 32-bit firmware is dead. Nobody can do anything with it. Whereas the 8-bit firmware, if I go to the escconfigurator.com website, I can still flash and update and do everything I need to do with my BLHeli S ESCs. So if you have BLHeli S, really nothing in this video actually pertains to you. Enjoy the benefits of using open source code. So from a certain perspective, this change doesn't mean a lot to you today. If you've got an ESC that's working, just keep using it. And for those who say, well, what if I want to update to a different firmware? I got to tell you, most of the time, I just use whatever firmware came on the ESC and it's fine. And I want you to keep that sentiment in the back of your head as we talk about the fact that there is a significant bug in BLHeli 32.9 that doesn't affect everybody, but it does affect some people. And that bug is that sometimes with BLHeli 32.9, if you disarm the quadcopter while you're flying, it won't rearm again until you power cycle it. So for example, if you're a racer and you crash and you disarm and you want to rearm and get back in the race, nope, you got to power cycle it. And this matters even more to freestyle pilots who often will crash somewhere where they may not be able to retrieve the quad. If you crash on top of a building or you crash on top of a tree and you want to rearm and try and fly home or shake the quad out of the tree, you just may not be able to do that. And like I said, I've got a bunch of quads with 32.9 on it. I've never personally had this happen to me, but there are many people who have had this happen to them. And if I lost a quad as a result of it, I would not be having much of a sense of humor about this. In just a second, I'm going to show you how to flash AM32 to your ESC if you decide that's something you want to do. But there's one more thing I want to talk about first, and that is, what is the future of the FPV marketplace now that BLHeli 32 is gone? And there's no question that manufacturers will not be able to keep making BLHeli 32 ESCs unless somebody like hacks the bootloader to allow them to flash firmware, which I guess is possible, but nobody's done it yet. So it kind of suggests that maybe nobody is going to do it. And even if they did do it, BLHeli 32 is not going to continue to be updated. So new hardware won't have targets and so forth and so forth. BLHeli 32 is well and truly gone. What I think the only possible outcome for the future is that AM32 will be the new standard. AM32 is under active development. I expect that it will be under much more active development now that every ESC manufacturer in the freaking world is going to be looking at the AM32 devs and saying, help make our ESCs work. So in the future, you will be able to buy an AM32 ESC and you will use standard tools to configure and flash it, similar to what you've already been doing. In fact, there are a few AM32 ESCs that you can buy today, right now, if you're interested in getting into that. But today, if you want to switch from BLHeli 32 to AM32, there's a pretty cumbersome and potentially problematic process that you need to go through. And I am now about to go through that process so you can, and well, even if you don't intend to flash, you can enjoy my pain as I struggle with it. Let's do it. In order to know whether you even can flash AM32, you're going to go to the target compatibility list found here, and I'll put a link to that in the video description below, and you're going to see if your ESC is on that list. Now, my ESC is the T-Motor G003. Is it the F55? G0. Oh, there it is. T-Motor F55A Pro G0. Yeah, I think it's the F55 Pro, because that's what Rotor Riot sells. Makes sense. And T-Motor F55A 4-in-1 is supported. Yay. So the first hurdle you need to clear is your ESC on this list? And if it's not, you're done. You're not flashing AM32 today. But mine is, so we'll proceed. The next thing we need to do is take note of this bootloader PB4 we're going to need that going forward. The first step of flashing AM32 to the ESC is to flash the AM32 bootloader to the ESC. Once that's done, we will be able to flash AM32 firmware using the USB port. So the nice part is that the painful process we're about to go through, we only have to do once. In order to flash that bootloader, we have to look at the ESC itself, and we have to find the MCU, the microcontrollers on the circuit board, and we have to find the programming pads for those MCUs. And we're going to connect a little device called an ST-Link programmer to those programming pads, and we're going to flash the AM32 bootloader. Here's my T-Motor F55 ESC, and I'm sorry to tell you, here, take a look at this picture from the web. On the underside of the ESC, all of these things are FETs. These are the FETs that drive the motors. And that means that the MCU is on this side underneath the heatsink. So I've got to pull the heatsink off to get at the programming pads, and Lord, I have no idea what I'm going to find. How can I do this without breaking something? I don't want to break something. What seems to be the safest to me is to come in with a flat head screwdriver and pry using the silicone gummy as the other side of the pry. So I'm not pressing on the circuit board at all. I'm just going to come in like this and twist this way to pry upward. And there we go. So on the one side of the ESC, we have a bunch of FETs, and on the other side, we have, well, apparently some additional FETs here, and two other components that we're going to need to identify. One of them is the FET driver, which is a separate chip that is in charge of making the FETs open and close to make the motors spin, and the other is going to be the MCU. And you can see here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 chips. There are going to be one FET driver and one MCU for each of the channels of the ESC. This is a 4-in-1, so that's why there's 8 chips. 4 of these are going to be the MCU and 4 are going to be the FET driver. And to tell which is which, I just kind of looked at them and I can see the markings on them. And one of them is marked G0, blah, 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 blah. And I remembered that this is a G0 ESC. And I thought, oh, G0 must be the name of the MCU in this ESC. And so I've decided that the chips with G0 marking on them are the MCU. So these 4 chips, 1, 2, 3, 4, are going to be our MCU. And we can see next to them, there are these little pads. And these are going to be the programming pads that we need access to in order to flash the ESC. There are some extra pads here that probably aren't programming pads, but we'll just have to figure it out as we go. Next, you're going to need to pick up an ST-Link programmer. You probably don't already have one. And if you're wondering, well, can I just use like a CP210 or FTDI adapter that I already own? The answer is apparently no, although I'm not 100% sure why. There are official STM32 programmers you can get from DigiKey. They're not that expensive and they're like official, so you know they're going to work, but you can also just like spend $10 to get this one off of Amazon, and that's pretty much what I've done, and it seems to work fine. I'll put a link in the video description if you want to pick that up. Next, we're going to need to get the STM32 ST-Link software that we're going to use to flash the bootloader to the ESC. We'll do that by going to this URL, which is in the video description below. We scroll down and we hit Get Latest, and sadly, oh, can we download as a guest? Okay, it's downloading, yay. Next, we need to download the bootloader file for our ESC. Remember that previously we determined that PB4 was the correct bootloader for our ESC. We're gonna go here to this link, which again is in the video description below, and we're gonna find the PB4 bootloader.hex. That appears to be this one. Yes, that's the only PB4 I see there. So we're gonna click on that, and then we're going to download raw file right here. Hey there guys, it's Joshua from the future. I have finished flashing my bootloader and nothing is working, and I think I just figured out why. Please don't make the same mistake I did. I've got the PB4 bootloader. Great, PB4. But look, PB4, PB4, PB4. There's more than one. PB4 is like the pin layout or the whatever. And then there's also, you have to match the MCU. Do you remember that we have the G07 something MCU? So what I need is G07 PB4. Is that unique? Here's an F051 PB4. That's for the 051 chip. Here's an F350 PB4. Yes, that's a unique combination. So I downloaded the wrong bootloader file. Now I'm going to download what I hope is the correct one. reflash all 4 of these effing things, and hopefully it'll work. The second file that we need is the actual AM32 firmware, and we're going to get that from this page, which is linked in the video description below. And we're going to have to look for show all 76 assets. Yes. We want the T-Motor 45, T-Motor G071. That must be ours. Yes, this is the G071 T-Motor C. We'll click on that, and it will download that file as well. On the ST-Link programmer, you're going to need to identify the SWDIO, the SWCLK, and the ground pads. You're going to need the data, the clock, and the ground pins. We've got wires plugged into each of those, and you can see there's other pins that might be used for other things, but we're not going to do that. Now, the ESC is actually going to get its power from a battery that we plug in. But in order to share communication between the ST-Link programmer and the ESC, they have to have a common ground. So I think the easiest way to accomplish that with this ESC is just to come in and hook on the ground side of the capacitor. There we go. With this little clip. These are super handy little clips, like alligator clips, but not. And I'll try and find a link to them on Amazon if you don't already have some. They're super handy to have around. Next, we're going to start the STM32 ST-Link utility, and we're going to get it ready for flashing. We're going to do that by clicking Target and Settings. And here in the mode, we want to change to Hot Plug. Next, we need to connect the ST-Link programmer's data and clock lines to the ESC. And this is going to require a little bit of trial and error. We previously determined that these were the 4 MCUs that we were going to need to flash. And you can see that next to them are sets of little pads, and some of those pads are going to be the data and clock lines. Now, in some cases, it's going to be more obvious than others which ones are which. So, for example, here we've got this MCU, and right next to it are these 2 pads, and those are the data and clock lines, or pads, for that MCU. If you look really close, you can sometimes even see the little traces, the outline of the trace going from the pad to the little tiny pins on the outside of the MCU. In this case, we've got these 2 pads here, and sure enough, those are the data and clock line for that one. However, in this case, there's 3 pads here, and we're just going to have to guess and try. And also, which one's the clock and which one's the data line? Well, basically, we're just going to guess 50-50. So there's going to be some trial and error there. Now, some tutorials will tell you that the thing to do is to solder wires to those little pads. And I'm not going to do that because, well, number one, I'd have to do that a whole bunch of times to solder each of the 4 MCUs. Number 2, they're tiny and they're hard to solder to. So here you can see that I have made little wire extensions out of some solid core wire that I have, just some spools of solid core wire. And so it's got some rigidity to it. I have jammed one end of those wires. Oops, it came out. I've jammed one end into the wires coming off the ST-Link programmer. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold them in place. I'm going to hold them like so. And I'm going to very, very carefully touch them to the, I can't do it because I got to get my face down in there to actually see what I'm doing. But I'm just going to carefully touch them to the pads and hold them on the pads and not move while I do the rest of the things. If you decide to do this, be real freaking careful. On some ESCs, these pads are nearby to some capacitors that have VBAT running through them. And if you short circuit something, then you're going to fry your ESC. In that case, maybe you better solder it with the power removed and then take it from there. I don't know. This is all risky. I told you this was a bad idea. So there we go. I've got them touching. We're going to power up the ESC. ESC is powered up. I'm going to click Target and Connect, and cannot connect to device. Okay, so either I've got the wrong pads or I have the wires in the wrong order. I'm pretty sure those 2 pads are the correct ones, so I'm just going to switch them left to right. I've just got them backwards, I'm guessing, and we're going to try again. There we go. Got it. Cannot read memory, disable readout protection, and retry. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is do Target Option Bytes and change the readout protection from level 1 to level 0. In addition, you need to go to the bottom of the screen in the write protection section and unselect all. If you do not do this, you will screw yourself up later in the process. Ask me how I know. Once you do this, you cannot go back. BLHeli is gone forever. Okay. Next thing I need to do is erase the chip. I'm going to do target erase chip, and it's going to give me an error. And then target erase sectors, and just select all the sectors, and that will work. Cannot connect to device. Must have moved my, oh, okay, that worked. And then the last step is to flash the bootloader, and we'll hit target program. We'll select the bootloader file here. We will enable skip flash erase. We don't want to erase any code that's already on there. Like if we were in the, well, we'll do skip flash erase, and we will start programming. Now I will shake off my hands, and I will do that 4 more times. And as I said, you're going to just put the wires on the pins, on the pads, and if it doesn't work, swap them, or maybe you've got the wrong pads. It's trial and error. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have 4 ESCs with the bootloader flashed, and we can proceed. I'm going to go to the website esc-configurator.com. I'm going to plug in my flight controller and my USB cable, and I'm going to connect to this ESC via BLHeli pass-through via the Betaflight flight controller. So open port selection, COM11, connect, and then I'm going to hit read settings. And sure enough, it was able to read the one ESC that I have currently flashed the bootloader to. Now, you'll flash all 4 of your ESCs with their bootloader, and you'll have 4 ESCs there now. But when you see that it's able to read the ESC, even though it says ESC unknown, that means that your bootloader is successfully flashed. The next step then is to flash AM32 firmware to the ESC. So I'm going to say flash firmware to ESC, and AM32 ESC is T-Motor F55A. Select version. I don't even know the differences. I guess I'll just take the latest one and flash. Unknown version layout is not yet supported. Wait, but I want to flash. What if we go to this page here and we download the AM32 configuration tool? It's a standalone tool. There's a Windows and a Mac OS version, and you get it just from, well, you saw the main AM32 page. And here it is. We're going to run serial port connector.exe. We're going to select COM11 and connect, and I think it's M2 is readable. Oh, I want to flash. I got to click the flash page. M2. Okay. Load connected, no EEPROM. Okay. Load firmware. Oh. Okay. Downloads T-Motor G071 firmware. That's the second file that I downloaded earlier. And flash firmware. Oh. Okay. Guess I have to do it with this multi-ESC tool instead of the ESC configurator tool, which is my preferred way of doing it. But okay, we'll use the multi-ESC tool, and then we'll have a working ESC, or will we? Actually, there's one more thing you need to do, which is after the flash is finished, you must click the Send Default Settings button. I don't know why it doesn't do this automatically, but it doesn't. Yes, that's it. We have a working ESC. Oh, but there's only one way to be sure it's actually a working ESC, and that's to spin a motor. I get the beeps. And the motors spin. So hopefully you have followed along in this process, and you also have got the beeps and your motors also spin. And if they do, then can I remind you that I have a Patreon? Yeah, I put this Patreon plug at the very end of the video because I figured if you're one of the few people who made it all the way to this step, then you're the ones who really feel like you're getting something out of these content. And if you do, then a great way to say thank you is to join my Patreon. It's as little as $2 a month to get in at the lowest level. You can choose to contribute more if you feel like I've earned it, and you can always raise or lower the amount whenever you feel like you would like to change how much you're paying each month. But even a tiny, tiny amount like $2 a month, and frankly, it's been $2 a month for like 5 years. Realistically, inflation, it should be like $4 a month now, but I'm not going to do that. Even that small amount makes a big difference when enough people add up. So there's a link in the video description if you decide that today is the day that you want to sign up. And if today's not the day, I don't care. I'm just going to keep making the content, and maybe someday that day will come. If you're interested in seeing how an AM32 ESC flies in the real world, I bought at SkyStar's AM32 ESC. It comes pre-installed with it. I put it on my 160 mile an hour 6S 2800 kV drone just to see if it blew up. And if you're interested in getting into the AM32 ecosystem, I'm going to put a card on screen to that video, and you can go check it out. I'll see you there.